sex by its nature is private. And it's private because if it's made public, it's scandalous. I think what happened to Patrick Brown was a cautionary tale for everyone. 2 allegations demolished our political system for a month. Okay, that's not so good. Well, so what we've done in the past is leave it private. Well, those days are gone. So the question is whether or not anybody can withstand that. I mean, one of the things that Solzhenitsyn wrote about, and I've read other commentators with regards to totalitarian societies, Orwell too wove this through his work, and also, no, I can't remember the other author, it doesn't matter.
Dostoevsky.
Everybody has a guilty little secret. And the totalitarians never let you forget that. Like, we're all imperfect, we're all flawed, we've all got pasts that where there are secrets that would be best remain hidden, you know, that we have hopefully transcended, you know. I don't know if anybody can tolerate that sort of scrutiny, not only into the public realm, but also into these quasi-judicial apparatuses, like the ones that are being set up at the universities. You think the courts do a bad job, you wait till you see what the universities do. It's hard to set up a court system. You know, and the fundamental problem with sexual assault cases basically is that, well, there are no witnesses. Well, how in the world do you adjudicate that? Believe the accuser. Well, no. Not reflexively, obviously, unless you're naive beyond belief and think that no one would ever use an accusation out of confusion, let's say, forgetfulness, or maliciousness. If you think any of those things, then the amount you know about human beings could be put in a thimble. So we have a presumption of innocence for a reason, but we're replacing that with believe the accused and preponderance of evidence, and it's part of the assault on English common law, which is regarded by the postmodern neo-Marxists as just another narrative and part of the patriarchal tyranny. The law schools they're not as bad as the faculties of education or social work, but that's about all you can say for them. I got wind of a bill, C-16 in Canada, that purported to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of protected groups in Canada. I started to do some investigation into that, and I found that the legislation was instantiating a new definition of human identity into the Canadian legal system, and the identity, or the gender identity, was predicated on the idea that there was no relationship between biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression, that those things were completely independent, and that gender identity and gender expression were essentially a matter of subjective choice.
Right.
And there was also an injunction that required people to use these gender-neutral pronouns, and I found that objectionable, partly because I regard the gender-neutral pronouns as part of the vanguard of a politically correct movement, and felt that I wasn't going to use, if you use the language rules that your ideological opponent demands that you use, you cede the territory to them.
Right.
And we've been ceding the territory to politically correct authoritarians for a very long period of time.
Give us an example of what these new pronouns are.
Z and zer are common. Sometimes people want to be referred to as they,
Right.
which sacrifices the distinction between the singular and the plural.
Yeah, and was traditionally the prerogative of Her Majesty the Queen,
Right.
nobody else.
Exactly.
And this whole use of Z and Zer is taken very seriously, very seriously.
Yes, well, Bill C-16 changes the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code to make discrimination on the grounds of gender identity or gender expression part of the hate speech provisions. And the failure to use the appropriate pronoun, that's the pronoun that's demanded of you, constitutes harassment and discrimination, and can be prosecuted under the hate speech codes. Now, the people who've been debating me in Canada claim that that would never happen, but they're not to be trusted in my estimation.
Right.
Once you put something into the law, they put it into the hate speech codes for a reason.
Yeah, yeah.
That's not an accident.
And my own experience of those commissions is that they always start out by saying, no, 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 this is just a mopping up operation for a few people out on the wild extremist fringe. Don't worry about them. Don't pay any attention to them. And it always creeps inward, inward, inward. And whatever it was ever intended to address way out on the fringe, it actually winds up ensnaring all kinds of people who aren't in the least bit on the fringe or extremist.
Well, I know that at the university there's already been a chill placed over any discussions about the biological differences between men and women. My own students, I'm a personality psychologist, and so part of my field is gender differences in personality. And my students have already reported to me when they're serving as teaching assistants in their classes that they're very cautious about what sort of claims they make. And it looks to me that one of the law's consequences is that it will make discussions of the biological differences between men and women. It seems extreme to believe this, but it appears to me to make them illegal.
Right, right. Which is
because the law insists that your identity has no relationship to the underlying biology. And in fact, one of the people I debated, who was a University of Toronto professor, he claimed that the scientific consensus for the last 4 decades is that there was no biological differences between men and women.
Right.
Well, it's strange, too, because it invalidates many of the left's own arguments. So, for example, with regards to transgender people, there's this idea that you can be a man born in a woman's body or vice versa. And obviously, that's a biologically predicated argument.
Right.
And now that they've switched identity to what's essentially subjective whim in the law, then it seems to me that the proper interpretation of transgender decisions is that it's a matter of choice. The law insists on that, and it insists the same thing with regards to sexual orientation.
Yes, again, it's this using whatever argument works for you. I mean, the argument on sexual orientation is that it's inherent, so that it's cruel to make a man who's attracted to other men go out and date women. It's because who he is cannot be changed.
Right. In fact, the conversion therapy, so to speak, was banned in Ontario on exactly those grounds, and that's basically a biologically predicated argument.
But then when it comes to gender, we're now saying you can take any point on the spectrum.
Or off the spectrum. Yes, because that's actually written into the policies.
Right.
You can be anywhere on the spectrum or nowhere between men and women. And that was one part of it that I particularly objected to, because I really don't understand what it means to be off the spectrum. I don't believe that it's a spectrum to begin with. And you have to use technical language when you're writing legislation. It's not a spectrum, it's a modified bimodal distribution, right? So there are feminine men, obviously, and masculine women, but they're a small proportion of the population. The bulk of the population stacks up at the standard gender poles. And to be nowhere on the distribution, I guess that, I'm not sure exactly what that means. It could be an error in writing, or it could be referring to these people that claim identities that aren't human. And that's the next frontier, as far as I can tell. They call them otherkins.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, people laugh at this when you explain it. When you talk about otherkins, or when you say, I'm supposed to use Z and Zer and all the rest of it. But nobody who matters in our society is laughing at this, including your employers and your students and the government of Canada. They all take this stuff deadly serious.
Yes, well, I got 2 letters from the university warning me to stop making my public pronouncements that I would refuse to use these non-standard pronouns, even though the pronouns are fabrications and they haven't entered the common parlance. They've been imposed, and that's a legislative novelty, to impose a form of speech on someone. It's not a limit on your free speech, it's a demand that you use a certain kind of, in my estimation, ideologically motivated language, very ideologically motivated. And I've studied the development of totalitarianism for a very long time, and one of the things I know is that, well, it's the issue of ceding control over language. And so the government has carelessly made a precedent, and the precedent is compelled speech, essentially.
Yeah, and absolutely disgraceful. As you said, this word didn't exist until the day
Well,
before
and there's all
yesterday.
sorts of words. There's
Yeah.
not, and there's no agreement on which ones should be used.
No, no.
And people can also demand to be addressed with one set of words one day and another set another day. That's the
Yeah.
gender fluid types who claim to be men one day and women the next.
Right, right.
I think I'm essentially a classic liberal,
Right.
you know, in the old school sense. I'm an individualist.
And your basic position is, if someone wants to decide they're an otherkin, that's fine for them. But there's absolutely no reason why 34 million other Canadians should be compelled by law to accept that.
Yes, well, that's it. I mean, there's this idea that using someone's pronoun is a mark of respect. You know, if I call you he, that's a mark of respect. And that what I'm doing by not using these pronouns on demand is showing lack of respect for someone. And I don't buy that argument at all. There's nothing more generic than referring to someone by the pronoun, and you basically do it based on a casual assessment of their appearance.
Right.
No one has the right to impose their interpretation of their own identity on someone else. I mean, even children know that, right? Children have to negotiate a game if they want to play it with other people.
Yeah.
At least children who've been properly socialized know that.
Right. And this is, in actual fact, a kind of desocialization.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where normal social relations are replaced by ever more complex state mediation between different power groups.
By subjective whim enforced by state power, fundamentally.
Right.
Yeah.
The target of the anti-free speech people is, you've got to back him or her 100%, because otherwise they're going to be coming for you next.
Yeah.
And that's what they should be doing. It doesn't matter whether the guy seems a bit, and I, in a sense, I blame myself for that, because when these laws first came in, and it was some kind of crank who wanted to quote Leviticus in a column against homosexuals, you thought, well, you know, what's the big deal if they shut him up? And the fact is that you may think he's a crank, and you may think he shouldn't be quoting Leviticus and saying the godless sodomites are going to roast in hell or whatever. But the fact is, if you won't defend that guy, it just moves in all the time, and suddenly there's no space for public discourse at all, as you're now discovering.
Yeah. Well, I would say the press in the first couple of weeks, because this has been going on for about 2.5 months now, the press in the first couple of weeks was more ambivalent towards my stance, but they turned hard behind me.
Right.
And so that was good.
Yeah. That's a pattern I recognize too. That's like they don't realize, and these are people who are in the words business.
Yeah.
And they don't realize.
Yeah, well, we take free speech for granted. We actually take our whole civilization for granted. And we don't understand that it rests on certain foundation blocks, and that if you move those blocks, then all hell will break loose. And I think that our civilization is a lot more fragile than people really understand, and that it's also much more imperiled than people understand. I mean, I think we made a huge mistake when Salman Rushdie was put under the fatwa, and also we made a huge mistake when those Danish cartoons were published. And we're also in a situation now where your right to say anything critical about religious beliefs, unless they're Christian, fundamentally, is seriously in jeopardy. And that's so dangerous that it's almost beyond comprehension. That puts us back in the medieval times. We've been cowed.
Yeah.
And we're cowing ourselves as well with these laws that demand equality of opportunity and equality of outcome overall. And they were teaching equality of outcome as social good to the HR staff at the University of Toronto with their mandatory anti-racism and anti-bias training.